afternoon. Welcome to Insight. I'm Shalini Verma. India's GDP hit a three-year low of 5.7% in the first quarter of the current fiscal, as a result of which the government is trying to implement a plethora of measures to stimulate economic growth. It is also the weakest growth since the first quarter of 2014, though economic growth has been slowing for 5 quarters, weighed down in part by demonetization and also by a new nationwide sales tax, as seen by observers. On the other hand, some analysts and investors also say that these very steps and others, such as inflation targeting, a new bankruptcy framework and encouraging foreign investment, have laid the groundwork for a much faster expansion once the $2 trillion economy adjusts. In the middle of it all, the finance minister has assured that all necessary steps will be taken to boost the economy. Government is considering additional measures to bolster economy that has hit a three-year low of 5.7% in the first quarter of the current fiscal. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley has held a series of meetings in the last few days with some of his ministerial colleagues and senior government officials to take stock of the situation and firm up steps to push up growth. Since early 2016, GDP growth has fallen for 6 consecutive quarters. In the April to June quarter, it has touched a three-year low of 5.7%. It stood at 6.1% in the previous quarter. The falling growth rate for each quarter is attributed to decrease in domestic consumption as well as external spending on Indian goods and services. The growth figures reveal a further slowdown in manufacturing and agriculture, with a third consecutive quarter of decline. Its impact is clearly seen globally, with India losing the fastest growing economy tag to China for the second straight quarter. And only 2 years ago, India was touted as a rare bright spot in a gloomy global economy, with its GDP growing out and GDP growth outpacing a slowing China. So why is the economic growth faltering now? Which are the most stressed sectors, and what kind of economic stimulus is needed at this hour? To talk more on this, I am joined by Dr. Yashovardhan Pathak on the panel, who is the Additional Commissioner GST, and Dr. Praveen Jha from the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, School of Social Sciences, JNU, also joins me on the panel. Welcome to the program. Well, I'd like to understand it from you, Dr. Jha. What is the broad picture that one gets of the economy? Is this really a period of slowdown?
It is indeed a period of the slowdown. On that, we have no doubts whatsoever. For 6 consecutive quarters, and the numbers tell you, even though there are lots of issues about the numbers as regards the new methodology of calculating growth, etc. Nonetheless, even if we leave those things aside, and I mention that precisely because there is a degree of skepticism amongst large number of economists about these numbers in any case. In fact, some would argue that figures are even lower than what these numbers tell us.
Okay.
Right? But let's leave that for the moment. It is indeed the case that there has been a very significant slowdown over the last 3 years or so. If we look at particular sectors, whether it is manufacturing or more recently agriculture, which is in huge stress. If we talk about the informal economy, by now there is near consensus that demonetization was indeed a major blow to India's 90% plus economy. So if we take all these things to account, and I think even those who probably thought about 1 year ago that things may start improving soon on many fronts, including the GDP growth, I think there is near consensus and acceptance even in the official quarters, as the finance minister has rightly said that yes, things are worrisome and we need to take some urgent measures, etc. Okay. So I think on that there is no doubt whatsoever.
Dr. Pathak, would you agree with that?
Well, I would not agree with what the professor has to say. The slowdown, I believe we are reading too much into 1 quarter slowdown of 5.7% GDP. There are many shining lines still in the economy. The foreign exchange reserves are at an all-time high of $400 billion. And out of these $400 billion, last $100 billion have just come in last 3.5 years. the inflation in last more than since March, inflation is rovering around 1.5%, as low as 1.5%. Now it's about 3.4%.
Right.
The foreign direct investment, the foreign portfolio investment,
all that has picked up.
All that has picked up and are at an all-time high.
That's true. In fact, the FPIs were at a record high. The maximum has come this year itself in March.
Absolutely, absolutely. The stock markets are at an all-time high, doing wonderfully well. And you name the sectors, the metals, the infra, they are all doing very well. The Honorable Finance Minister did explain very convincingly to everyone as to what was the reason of this 5.7% growth. There was destocking by the manufacturing sector in prior to GST. GST was to be launched on 1st of July, and prior to GST, the April quarter, April, May, June, there was destocking by the manufacturing. So the 5.7% picture that we see, in that only what has gone down is the manufacturing and the mining.
And the mining, right.
On the contrary, the service sector is very robust. They are growing. The sectors like hotel industry, the other sectors.
What about agriculture?
Agriculture is doing good. Agriculture is on the lines. It's not gone down. It's not gone up. But the services are doing very well. Added to that, the first 4 months, the income tax collection is 19.5% positive. The
Right.
growth is at about 19.5%. The net direct tax collection is 19%. So all that picture gives you a idea that we still have a very the fundamentals of Indian economy.
But then let's understand that why this quarter growth is so important, because we are comparing ourselves with China, and we know that we were seen as one of the bright spots. We were the fastest growing economy, but the last two quarter growth percentage is
somehow
not helping us retain that tag.
You see, the question that you put to me was regarding the GDP, right? And if you look at last 6 quarters, the numbers are 7.9, 7.5, 7, 6.1, and now 5.7. All this is from the government sources, right? So on that, and that was your question, on that there cannot be any doubts whatsoever. As regards other issues, we can come to each one of those.
Right.
So I just wanted to make that
Okay, Dr.
correction.
Pathak, then I want to understand the last 2 quarters, what is it that has really gone wrong? That's why this figure is in fact dipping. We are not able to retain a 7% thing.
We have to understand that in the last quarter, from if you take April to June, a very major revolutionary step was taken in the form of launching of GST in the 1st of July. Because of GST, the manufacturing sector, they did some destocking, as we say that. So the only thing that has gone down in the first quarter, April, May, June, is the manufacturing per se and the mining.
That you just said, that's a destocking part which is really gone against. Okay.
Apart from that, I don't see any reason, because
is
if you
demonetization a factor, as many are looking at?
Not at all. Demonetization is not a factor, because the finance minister did explain that if anything, it would have to do with demonetization, it would have come in the last quarter of 2016 or the April, January to March, or that would have reflected in November, December. So all that was not done. So demonetization, in fact, has done better. I mean, after demonetization, the economy is doing well. The more of the investments have risen down. The entire ease of doing business and the economy, the formal economic channel, the things are
they have
a better picture.
Okay. Now, Dr. Jha, now this is a very interesting picture. We get 2 sets of views here on GST as well as demonetization. We know and we understand that the investments, particularly the foreign investments, have really picked up, and that is also on the basis of the reform agenda, the reform path that the government has been following. One of it indeed is the GST. Now let's look at this aspect and what the others say, that these 2 very reasons have led to the downfall of the growth. How do you look at that? Is there a balancing view that can be struck here?
Listen, as regards GST, Shalini, my sense is that it's much more controversial. I mean, there are many who argue that there would be substantial acceleration in GDP. There are many who are very, very skeptical about it. And that is a very slippery terrain.
Now, let me just add here, because what the government says is that it's not the best framework so far, but at least we have a framework in place which is open to amendments in future. Yeah.
Sure enough. But in any case, you see, that is an area, as I said, is if you talk to most experts, they would tell you that it is a slippery terrain, number one. Number two, if you talk to most business persons currently, right, there is a very ambivalent attitude towards GST. Right? I mean, like my co-panelist, I keep talking to people in the ground, on the field and so on. So, you know, I think the jury will take time to be out on that.
Okay.
Right? As regards the first, demonetization, I think there is no doubts whatsoever, even within the government. Right? They keep saying that it has had, and we saw the numbers. You see, if this 6 consecutive quarters, it is obviously the case that that may have been one of the key factors, even if you forget about anything else. Simple arithmetic.
How do you look at the thing that Dr. Pathak just said about the manufacturing particularly dipping because of the destocking that happened ahead of the GST?
Yes.
And the mining sector, the two sectors which are really making it more difficult for this growth figures to pick up.
No, certainly, that's part of the story. And as regards agriculture, we know that in any case it continues to be a gamble of monsoons.
Right.
Right. So there were 2 bad years and there was sort of some improvement. But then if you look at what's happening in India currently, across states, there are at least 15 major states where you have farmers up in arms. Right. These include sort of, you know, kind of citadels of the ruling party states as well.
Okay.
So clearly, you know, agriculture is not in a good state at all.
So for all the right reasons,
let me just give you one number. Look at rural wage growth. Look at figures for 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. There is a massive secular deceleration.
Okay.
Right. So if you start looking at these numbers carefully, there is no doubt whatsoever that there is a very, very significant problem with the countryside, with rural India. On that, I mean, I don't think anyone can.
Dr. Pathak, the fact that the finance minister says the inflation, as we believe, is at 3.4%. The finance minister says that it's still in a very comfortable zone of under 4%.
Absolutely.
Is that a satisfactory sign, or how would you respond to the alarm bells that are now ringing on the veggie prices, which are picking up, of course, indeed due to the monsoon season and whatnot? Yes. How do you look at the inflation issue right now?
I would give you an entire picture of inflation in the last 4 months. I guess in the month of March, the inflation dipped to the extent of 1.5%. That was at an all-time, I mean, in the last decade or so, it was at an all-time low. After March, inflation is hovering around between 1.5% to now 3.4%. Very comfortable. I mean, we can't. So that's what my friend says, that if the rural economy would have been in distress, if the agriculture would have not been performing as we would have liked it to, these two can't go simultaneously. Inflation at an all-time low and the food production or the CPI or the retail inflation at hovering around between 1.5 to 3%. So I don't see any cause for concern in the.
Dr. Jha, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to say that, you see, inflation is not simply a supply side phenomena, right? It has a lot to do with what's happening on the demand side as well. And we have to look at the combination of both these. So I told you that as regards rural demand, that is decelerating, and that deceleration also shows up in real wage rates. Now, if you take that into account, clearly there is a massive deflation in rural economy. Okay? Now, that could be because of huge hit in the incomes of large segments of the population. If that is indeed the case, then even if in some cases you have reasonable outputs, okay, and you will find a situation that there is slackening of demand, prices go down, okay, temporarily at least. So it can be, you know, all kinds of situations. So there is no simple one-to-one kind of linkage
connection
that we can talk about.
Dr. Pathak, do you want to add something?
And inflation figures.
Okay.
again you hear all kinds of things, and we have seen very difficult phases in terms of tomato prices, onion prices, all kinds of things, even in the last 6 months.
You're talking about the...
Yes, what the consumers are getting, the prices that they have to dish out. So, going by, let's say, some estimates, WPI or consumer price indices, etc., you know, you really have to sort of ask what is the report from the fields and so on. So, one needs to be much more sensitive in terms of talking about these prices, etc.
First I would go to the growth part, which my friend was saying. The growth of financial year 2016-17 was around 7%. Till 16-17, we were the fastest growing economy in the world. Now it's only in the last April to June that the concerns have been raised. I believe we are reading too much into that. It's a very transient thing. It's a very temporary phenomenon, and we have reasons to explain that. GST is one, and as if demonetization would have been the cause, it would have reflected in both. It would have reflected in the service sector as well. It would have reflected in
all the other sectors.
All the other sectors as well, which is not the case.
Okay. Well, we'll continue discussing on this aspect and understand what the state of economy is at this juncture. Time for a very short break in Insight Now. Welcome back. India has witnessed a rise in FDI and FII inflows in recent years. Many observers believe that it is largely driven by a positive sentiment and the pace of reforms undertaken in the last few years. FDI has been steadily rising over the past 2 years, but FII inflows started strengthening only after December last year. In the past, the Economic Survey had hinted that the foreign direct investment in India has received a dramatic boost from the launch of Make in India initiative and other such programs.
Last 3 years of Modi government has been witness to a series of steps taken to ensure economic reforms. Financial inclusion, crackdown on black money, transparency and accountability were some of the key ingredients of the Modi government's poll promise of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. The passage of GST as the biggest indirect tax reform since independence, along with some key legislations on Benami transactions, bankruptcy and insolvency code, recovery of debts, arbitration and conciliation, real estate bill, has accelerated the optimism around economy. The FDI inflows has grown by 29% to over $60 billion in 2016 and 17. The FIIs have also seen an increase, though the absence of revival in private investment cycle is still acting as a drag on the economy on multiple fronts. New projects are yet to happen in a major way, while the government is trying hard to push the existing stock of stalled projects.
And India ranks 130 out of 190 nations in ease of doing business, says the World Bank report. India has ranked within the top 50 countries in parameters such as protecting minority investors, getting electricity and getting credit, but lacks in issues like construction permits. Is India a more investor-friendly destination today? Well, to talk more on this, I am joined by Dr. Ram Upendra Das, Centre for Regional Trade, Ministry of Commerce. Welcome to the program. Well, Dr. Das, let me first take a view from you about the growth figures. What does it say about the state of the economy? Is this a phase of slowdown, or would you look at it otherwise?
See, I have a mixed feeling actually, because if you see some of the other macro parameters, if you see the inflation, if you see current account deficit to GDP ratio, the foreign exchange reserves have touched an all-time high of 400 billion US dollars. I have a, and then FDI, which was just mentioned, I have a feeling that because of these two major disruptions, demonetization as well as implementation of GST, which is far from complete, you would have expected very disruptive profile of the Indian economy at the macro level. Second is that it is not the growth which is a problem, it is the growth rate which is a problem. So, Indian economy is still growing, it is just that by its own benchmark the growth rate has gone down.
Okay.
Therefore, in my view, it is not a situation where we need to press a panic button. At the same time, I would also like to mention that because of growth rate in employment also slowing down,
okay,
it is good to hear that the government is mulling over taking certain steps to address this situation, and perhaps this is the right time. It is not too late yet.
Okay. How important is, since you said that it's a benchmark that we've set for ourselves and from there we are dipping, we have had this competition with China and we were in fact seen as the fastest growing economy. Only the last two quarters the figures have been a little dwindling, they're not really in a very comfortable zone. But then what really happens to that analysis of our economy globally vis-a-vis that of China's?
See, even Chinese economic growth came down. So, going by China's benchmark, China also would not be doing well if you say India is not doing well.
At this point of time, our growth rate, the figures now for the first quarter, they are lower than that of China's, Malaysia's and Philippines.
Which is fine because the base is very different across Philippines or Malaysia or India or China. Our base is much larger as compared to Philippines and Malaysia.
Before you joined us, Dr. Jha was also commenting on the methodology for GDP calculation and whatnot. Would you like to say something on that?
See, I mean, we can have a separate program on the methodology, but even if we go by the methodology which is there is no denying the fact that there is some slowing down and the figures are suggesting that there is some problem.
Okay.
If you see private investment, it has languished, and in my view this is one area where there is a puzzle which needs to be addressed. For instance, if you see the stock market and the capitalization there, you see a lot of good things happening. At the same time, private investment is not picking up. Now, the question is, where is that money going to?
Yeah.
So, the answer is maybe a large part of it is actually going to the speculative purposes rather than actual investment.
Okay.
Now, that is something which needs to be focused upon. So, there are problems, and then we should also understand that India is a big economy, and when you are handling an economy of this scale and size, when you are actually engaging externally at a very large scale, and then on top of that you are actually trying to address some of the policy reforms which earlier used to be criticized, that we have a policy paralysis, and today now if the government is trying to address, say if it is trying to address corruption, if it is trying to address GST and unification of the Indian market, there is always a possibility that things have not actually gone on the way you actually want them to be implemented, because implementation is something which is an iterative process.
And it's a process.
It's a process.
The fact that it's just happening now.
You cannot plan a full implementation which will be foolproof.
Okay, Dr. Jha, very quickly.
Since it's not a planned economy,
forget
about kind of major directions that the government can give to the economy. We are living in a completely different era in that respect. But in any case, this private investment is something which really is a very good marker of what's been happening and what is likely to happen.
Okay.
Right? And going by numbers of FDI, FII, I mean, I don't take those numbers very seriously. In a sense, they are like albatross around our necks, right? Because a great deal of it, actually, we are sort of harming ourselves by maintaining the kind of stocks that we are maintaining, by investing in very low return kind of, let's say, American treasuries and so on and so forth. So, there is a problem there which we need to, again, I would say that as Upendra mentioned, on that again we can have a completely different session, etc. But the real issue is,
Right.
I mean, two things which I take as very serious markers. One is private investment. Two, what's happening to the credit.
Okay.
Okay, credit from the banking sector and so on and so forth. If you look at April to August bank credit, it shrank by 1.8%, which is negative growth. This is the lowest in last 13 years, right? A State Bank of India report recently mentions that the credit growth for the year ending last March was lowest in 63 years.
Okay.
Now, these are, of course, very, very worrisome numbers, right?
Well, I'd like to understand
And
it from
sorry, if
very
I can,
quickly, Doctor.
and I think, instead of getting just trapped in growth rates per se, one really needs to look at what growth does. And the single most important indicator there for me is employment generation, right? And we can come to that as and when you want.
Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect, and that's something which is connected to the economic growth part. But let's understand these figures of FPIs and FDIs. Even you said it, Dr. Pathak. One wants to understand, what does it say about our investment-friendly destination tag, and the fact that is the ease of doing business really, improving? What is behind the private investment not picking up to the scale that it should have in that case?
I would just like to reiterate one very important event that just happened last week. After this report of 5.7% growth rate came, just about a couple of days later, we had a statement from the World Bank chief, who said the India's growth story is very much intact, and even this year our growth should be somewhere around 7%. For the financial year 2018-2019, he presented a better picture. I mean, somewhere around even more than 7%. This is after this 5.7%, and he says India is doing better than China. I mean, to that extent. Now, once we say that our FDI, we are attracting the maximum FDI from the institutions, we are getting the maximum foreign portfolio investment, foreign institutional investment, that itself shows the kind of confidence that the world has for India.
Many people are saying that because this money is coming largely in the debts market, that's not really all that good. Would you like to please elaborate on that?
Debt market? I mean,
yeah.
If the stock markets are doing well, if now you see a revival in the let's say the infra sectors, the sectors like metals, the sectors like banking, there were some issues with the banks. There were issues with regard to NPAs, but once the pace takes up, I believe those NPAs will be taken care. Most of the sectors like the steel, the sectors like the infrastructure, once they start repaying those debts to the bank, I believe a lot of gloom that has perhaps set in.
Yes, there are reports that the government may consider recapitalization of the PSU banks. Is that one of the things which the government may consider doing now?
I mean, that's a positive step, but I'm not the right person to
but
comment
you see,
on
let's understand what kind of an impetus can really be given at this juncture. There had been, Dr. Das, a lot of talks on, in fact, the finance minister, when he spoke of the measures that should be taken in order to boost the economy, he also spoke of the fuel prices. He said that the spike in the fuel prices, that has to be read differently. And the states that are demanding that the centre must be doing something, they must first initiate those steps within those states. There are several other measures that should be taken in order to see that this spike can be contained, because after all, the government needs revenue, and the oil revenue is important.
And the second thing is that this is one of those products which are actually excluded from GST, and it is a state subject, so that is why the emphasis today is on the action by the states, and that is why you have to see what is happening at the level of central government, what states are going to actually do, because when it was matter of revenue, they excluded this product from the GST basket, and now you are in a situation whereby states have to actually respond to this.
But that's really passing the buck, frankly, if you ask me.
Okay. But what is it that, since the fact that the decision of fixing it along with the international prices, it came after a lot of, discussions and whatnot that came from all quarters. So what is it that one can do in terms of fuel prices?
This again, I mean, obviously, most of the things that we are talking about in terms of policy reforms, they have a long history, 15 years, 20 years, etc. And we can talk of, a couple of very important interventions in the last 3 years, but just a couple of them.
Okay.
This bankruptcy law, for instance, I mean, that's a big thing, but how long will it take to start delivering the results and so on? These are still very uncertain, right? But in any case, as regards the oil prices issue which you are raising, clearly, I mean, there was a decision taken long ago, and we are continuing that. And in that sense, some of us were major critics of it all through, that this is not the road to go.
Okay.
Right? Because of all kinds of other implications that it has. So, it's in that sense, a difficult sort of choice at the current juncture. If you agree with the perspective, then you basically say, sure enough, go along. I mean, let there be that kind of alignment between the international prices and the domestic prices, don't tamper with the market and so on, if you believe in that perspective. But I come from a different perspective altogether. But being as part of this perspective, then how can you help the adverse impacts of it, containing at least some of that? And I don't think here it can be a center versus states. I think the center will have to take as much responsibility for it as the states.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
that would be my take on
Dr. Das.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with him. It is, but I also would say it is not passing the buck, because see, we have to see any price rise or even decrease in the context. One of the effects of oil price rise is in terms of increased transportation costs, which gets passed on to, fruits and vegetables and daily items. Now, given the scenario of both wholesale and consumer price index related inflation, I have a feeling that on one hand, you have a problem of revenue, because today in this scenario, government will have to adopt a Keynesian kind of a policy where you actually go in for higher public investments. Now, for that you require revenues. Now, there are projections, because GST has been crafted in a manner that it does not have too much of tax incidence. So, overall tax collections will go up, but not to an extent that it actually hurts people, except some segments. Therefore, perhaps this is also being seen as something which is a source of revenue. In a context when even if transportation prices actually go up, we can actually absorb the inflationary pressure, because some bit of inflation overall at the macro level is also required, and this is a age-old debate between growth and inflation. There is this inflation growth trade-off which happens.
I'll have to take a very short break. After the break, we'll continue the discussion on this subject. Please stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, a lot has been said and done to revive the infrastructure sector. This is one sector which needs a lot of investment, a drive to remove the structural and operational bottlenecks, and which also indeed has the potential to take the economy at a different level.
Revival of the infrastructure sector has been one of the key priorities of the NDA government over the last 3 years. The government has increased public investment in infrastructure, announced measures to address issues impeding the sector, such as access to long-term funding, inequitable risk allocation in public-private partnership projects, adequate institutional capacity, and so on. Besides this, Sector-specific policies have also been announced. Major growth seen in construction of roads and highways as well as in the railways are seen as positive indicators. Though key issues faced by the sector in the past few years relate to funding, the financial situation of their developers and inflation pressures. Overcoming such challenges will take a little longer. India's fastest growing economy tag had made it an attractive destination for long-term global infrastructure investors. Clearly, the time to revive the sector is ripe, and all efforts should be put in to remove bottlenecks and push infrastructure growth.
So how can the investment cycle be revived? What is the way forward for Indian economy? Well, according to the sources, the government may also consider a 60,000 crore stimulus package or spending in the current financial year. The point is that will it really help? Now, let me understand it from you, Dr. Pathak. The stimulus package, what kind of package would the government be considering here in order to revive the sectors? Because one understanding is that there should not be any cutting on the public spending on different sectors. We know that the public spending, particularly on the infrastructure, in the infrastructure sector and the others, have really picked up. But this continuous balance is so very important, and that's where we heard the finance minister saying that the revenue sources again can't be cut down. So how do you look at the way forward? What about the stimulus package?
Well, I'll take up from what Mr. Jha said, that as of now, the tax to GDP ratio in the country is somewhere around 16 to 16 point, between 16 to 17%. The government has taken the bull by the horns, both because of demonetization as well as because of GST. The revenue of the government would be at a very comfortable position. As you said, in the first 4 months, the direct taxes have already increased by 19.5 to 20%, 19%. Even in the GST, the finance minister said that we have increased our targets. The internal targets of the government has been surpassed. So all this puts us in a very comfortable position in regards to public investment. And of course, that's the call for the government as to where they want to put in those investments, whether in the infrastructure sector or recapitalization of the banks or whatever. But as regards the revenue position, I believe it's a very comfortable scenario as of now.
Okay, Dr. Das, as of now, do you see that the economy is giving very mixed kind of signals, as we had been talking about in this whole program, as to how some sectors seem to be really needing that kind of push, but the others are comfortably doing fine. So let's look at any kind of stimulus support which the government may be considering. Which are those sectors, the stressed ones, that would really need it?
No, you're very right, because the macro variables and the trends in them, they are basically average, which is an average of the overall economic activity. If you disaggregate the macro picture and the estimates and the projections, you would find that there are many sectors that are actually doing well, and I do not think that they require any support, because they have got into their own momentum both in the domestic market as well as in the external market. But of course, the investments that need to come in, say in infrastructure, this is one area where you would find that it is the public sector which actually leads it, and to some extent there is a crowding in, because private sector is mostly looking at short-term investments with profits, whereas the gestation lag in infrastructural projects are too long, and there only the public sector can provide the lead. And therefore, one of the sectors which would require a fiscal stimulus from the government would be construction, infrastructure and these areas. Second is because the volume of investments in these areas are very huge, and the lock-in period is very long. Therefore, I do not see too much of crowding in from the private sector, and therefore, if at all the fiscal stimulus has to come, it has to come in this sector from the government. Second is, of course, the monetary transmission from RBI reducing its rate and the banks not passing it on in the same proportion. In some cases, there has been decline in interest rates, but it is not proportionate. and commensurate with the RBI cuts, rate cuts. That is been a problem.
Okay.
Now, largely that problem has been because of the NPAs in the banking system, and therefore capitalization was the issue, which to some extent in my view was addressed because of demonetization also, because lot of cash actually got deposited. But now as it appears, the calculations suggest that the government will have to focus on that. Once that happens, then the credit offtake, which Praveen was mentioning, can be perhaps tapped, and also maybe that will be an incentive for the private sector to go and borrow for investment.
Okay. Dr. Jha, what according to you are those areas that would need special focus from the government from now on?
See, I mean, there are many challenges, right? First, this quantum itself is not something which is really huge, given the needs of several sectors, etc. So, obviously, it will have to be government's call. For instance, it could all go into maybe capitalization of banks, and maybe that's a good thing, right? We know that this whole issue of stressed assets, etc., has been a major challenge. So, instead of spreading it too thinly, it may be a good idea, given government's own judgment, what they think. If you ask me, I would say that countryside or rural areas is in need of massive support right now. Can we do something about that? That is something which might in fact inject the much needed demand, because I think that is a major issue right now. You have excess capacities. You just look at all the commentators. Everyone is bemoaning about the fact of excess capacity in sector after sector after sector, right? So, can we do something in that direction? Infrastructure, of course, a major challenge. Again, there has to be a balance between this glitzy infrastructure and infrastructure which really gives you bang for money, which is spread out to rural infrastructure and so on and so forth. So, there are all kinds of options that we can think of. And in terms of particular sectors, for instance, construction was mentioned. Let me just give you one stat. If you look at FDI inflows in the construction sector in the last 2 years, it was barely $218 million US dollars, which was 1/12 of the 2.6 billion that came in during the UPA's last 2 years.
Okay.
You can see that if you're really interested in giving support to the construction industry, right? I mean, the kind of gap which is there between the last 2 years of UPA and the last two years that we are talking about. So, I'm saying that
which means what does it really imply? What does it say?
I'm basically saying that sector is performing very poorly, in spite of some support in the last, let's say, last budget and the last couple of years, etc. But obviously, the gap that you have in terms of the resource requirement, that sector itself would constitute a major, let's say, demander of it.
Infrastructure growth, is that going to be one major challenge, especially the funding part, the money that is really needed along with the other resources? Dr. Pathak?
Well, it will be a major challenge, there is no doubt, but I think the government has a lot of room because of the comfortable revenue position. We have ample room to maneuver as to what choices, which direction it wants to take. So, I don't think that will be a cause for concern, or that is we need to magnify the gloom. I mean, absolutely, I don't believe in that.
Yeah, Dr. Jha,
may I just say very quickly, very quickly, my major disagreement on this question is that I think in terms of tax GDP ratio, our revenue position, we are not in a comfortable position.
Okay.
Okay. And if you look at, let's say, India in comparison with, let's say, even BRICS countries, look at tax GDP ratio, expenditure GDP ratio, etc. Look at, more importantly, the requirements that you have on the ground. And then you look at your fiscal space, revenue space. I don't think we are in a comfortable situation at all.
Dr. Das,
now, where can we get these resources from? That's a huge challenge.
That's the thing. Dr. Das, what would you like to say about it? Does it mean that we are going to have tough times? I mean, one wants to really understand if the rapid growth phase which we were once in, can we get it again? And the most important thing is how to sustain it. I think that's going to be the major challenge, since there is no dearth of growth, development that the country needs at various forums.
See, it can be very well sustained because we have so much headroom. If you see the savings to GDP ratio, if you see investment to GDP ratio, if you compare it with China, we have enough headroom. The development road that we have to travel is very long and unwinding, and therefore, I have a feeling that if these policies, which was actually disruptions in our economy, and these were some of the areas which we always wanted things to happen, because they have happened, they will take some time to settle down.
Okay.
With the fiscal stimulus, and I would add one more very important fiscal stimulus apart from the focus on rural areas, which was very rightly pointed out, is the 7th Pay Commission. If you remember the 6th Pay Commission, it came in 2008, just because before 2009, and 2008 was when the global crisis actually struck. That became a major fiscal stimulus. This time the 7th Pay Commission has not been in the same proportion, number one.
Okay.
Second, it has not been implemented say in many autonomous institutions and many the way it should have been.
Okay.
Third is that it has also not been able to translate into UGC and other states following that.
Okay.
So, a large part of fiscal stimulus from that also can be demand generating in the economy, and that will sustain, it will create its own momentum.
Dr. Pathak, very quickly, since we know that all this is interlinked with the personal growth of an individual too, and that's where I think one of the major challenges for India would be to see jobs being created in enough numbers. Do you think more efforts are really needed on that front now?
The efforts are needed, and I think the government is doing adequate on that.
Because with a lot of new schemes that have come up, from Make in India to startup to, of course, the kind of boost that we need in infrastructure.
Make in India is doing well, and there are people who very categorically said that once we implement GST and once GST, the effects of GST settle down, India would get into an era of double-digit growth. So once this things, let's say about in the next few quarters or in the next financial year, all that settles down, I believe this is a very temporary phase of slowdown, and once this gets over and the results of demonetization and the results of GST actually come, the growth would come at a it will again come down to this place where we are the fastest growing economy in the world. We are still, everybody is very hopeful about the India story. I mean, we interact with our friends abroad, we interact with people abroad.
Internationally, we are
it's a very positive things, very positive things happening in the country. The government, I mean, the sectors are opening up for FDI and other kind of investments. And it's just a matter of time. So I just believe that
it's a temporary
phase and a very temporary phase, and some major reforms which were contemplated for decades have taken place. So some whatever little minor disruptions, if you say, would have happened. The long growth story of India remains very positive and very intact.
Dr. Jha?
On the growth front, it's been the most worrisome story. And if you again go by government stats, Labour Bureau data, look at 11-12, right? I mean, it is generally accepted that 10 to 12 million people are likely to enter your labour market every year, and
so you think that
during the campaign time, if you remember, it was suggested that
job creation is going to be one major task.
So that 20 million jobs can be created, 2 crores, etc., etc. Now, what have been the figures? 11-12, it was barely 11.5 lakhs, right? Which was barely 10% of what the official estimate of people entering the job market is. 15-16, 1.5 lakhs. We are talking of 1% of what the official estimates of new entrants to the job market is. Now, if we are going to go this route, it is an extremely difficult journey that I foresee. We might have growth rate of 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, it doesn't matter, right? 9%, 10%, okay, even double digit. But the real challenge is how do these translate into jobs, and where are the jobs?
Dr. Das, concluding remarks from you on this very point.
Yes, but if you see the disaggregated picture, we have made our own calculations, which I was doing it in the context of trade and employment. We have found that there are areas like automobiles, pharmaceuticals, apparel, some textile areas, leather, plastics, there are jobs that are getting created. But what is happening is that there are some sectors which are actually not able to face the competition, and therefore they are also closing down. So the net effect, is not as rosy as compared to earlier years. Second point, earlier years we had very good exports of IT services, which also is got a hit because of the global scenario. Therefore, I have a feeling, and government has recently set up a very important task force on trade and employment, and I am very sure that there will be something which will come out to address this problem. I am not saying there is no problem.
Fine, fine. So we understand that job creation, employment generation is going to be one major challenge, along with, of course, pushing in investment and seeing that more infrastructure growth really takes place. But as our panelists say, it's going to be a temporary phase, and we'll really have to wait to see where these growth figures take us and where the India's growth story really goes. On that note, we'll end this discussion. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me in this program. Well, that's all for today in Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.